Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel To Be Like Christ. We are talking about Leviticus chapter 25 today in hopefully 5 minutes. This is a very long chapter. There's a lot in it, so let's just jump in right away and not waste any time. When did these events happen? Leviticus picks up right where Exodus left off. The children of Israel are at Mount Sinai in the wilderness. This would be approximately 1490 BC. We've got two terms to define in our definition section. The first one we've seen before. It's the word strangers or sojourners. The Bible uses the word strangers to describe foreigners, so people who weren't native Israelites, who lived amongst the Israelites and traveled with them in this case, both in the wilderness and in the land of Canaan. And then finally, the term redeem. Redeem means to gain or to regain possession of something via a payment, usually a payment of money. All right, so now for our very long outline, I think we have 55 verses in this chapter. Up first, section number 1, verses 1 through 7, the seventh year Sabbath. So God spoke to Moses while they were talking on Mount Sinai and instructed the Israelites that when they got to the Canaan land to keep a seventh year Sabbath. The Hebrews were to farm their land for 6 years, but on the seventh year, they were to let the land rest. Our second section, verses 8 through 22, this is a big one, the 50th year Jubilee. So when the Israelites entered Canaan and made it their home, the land was going to be divided up and given to different families. It was going to be divided up by casting lots, which is a process of random selection. Each family was going to receive a portion of land that would remain theirs forever. Now keep in mind, this hasn't happened yet, but it will happen when Joshua leads the people into Canaan. We'll read about that in the following books. The Israelites were then instructed to keep a 50th year celebration, a 50th year Jubilee. And on the year of Jubilee, all of the land that had been leased was to be returned to the original owners, those families that had received it by casting lots. The Jubilee year was also a year of rest for the land, like the seventh year Sabbath. The Israelites' fields were to remain unplanted and unharvested. Following the year of Jubilee, if a family wanted to lease their land to make a little bit of money, to get out of debt, for whatever reason, they could lease that land to somebody else, and they were to charge a price based on how many years were remaining until the next year of Jubilee, when that land would return to them or revert to them. If the Israelites kept God's instructions regarding the seventh year Sabbath and the 50th year Jubilee, then God promised to bless them in the land and to make it produce in abundance for them. All right, so that's the 50th year Jubilee. Our next section, verses 23 through 28, the sale and the redemption of land. So kind of as we already touched on, plots of land in Canaan were never to be sold permanently or in perpetuity. You could not give someone else the right to own your land forever because the land belonged to God. That's what he said. So land could only be leased for a period of time. If a poor man leased his land due to financial troubles, he had the right to redeem that land or to buy it back if he could, if he had the ability and if he had the desire to do it. Also, a close relative had the right to redeem the land. And if the land was not redeemed, it would remain in the possession of the one who leased it until that 50th year Jubilee, where everything reset and the land went back to the original families who received it in the casting of the lots. Then in verses 29 through 34, we're going to talk about the sale and the redemption of houses in the Canaan land. So in regards to the sale of houses that were in walled cities, if a house in a city was sold, the seller had the right to redeem it or to buy it back from the guy who purchased it for 1 year following the sale. If they did not redeem it within that 1 year, the buyer became the owner of that property, and it did not have to be returned in the year of Jubilee. So land outside of the cities, yes, that had to be returned during Jubilee, but if it was a house in a walled city, no, that was something that somebody could own forever. Now, that was true except for one exception. If the house belonged to a Levite, the house had to be returned in the year of Jubilee because the Levites They were the special priestly tribe, right? They didn't receive a portion of land when the Israelites took possession of Canaan, and that was by God's design. Don't worry, we'll talk about all that later. So if somebody bought a house from a Levite, it had to be returned in the Jubilee year. Additionally, a Levite had the right to redeem that house or to buy it back at any time. That 1-year time limit didn't apply. Okay, and then verses 35 through 46, laws related to poor Israelites. If an Israelite man fell on hard times and was unable to support his family and to give them shelter and food, it became his richer neighbor's responsibility to give him a place to live and to give his family something to eat. The neighbor was not allowed to loan him money at interest or to make profit off of selling him food. If a poor Israelite sold himself to a fellow Israelite as a hired servant, he said, "I'm poor, but I'll work for you, so that you give me money, give me a living," then that poor Israelite was not to be treated like a slave. They were supposed to be treated kind of in a higher class as a hired servant. The hired Israelite was to be freed on the 50th year Jubilee. So whatever debts he had, it was all canceled. He was relieved of his service. The Hebrews were allowed to buy and sell slaves of the nations around them, people who were not Israelites. However, they were not to make slaves of their own countrymen. All right, and then finally, one more section, verses 47 through 55, redeeming poor Israelites from a sojourner. All right, so if an Israelite became poor and he sold himself as a hired servant to a sojourner or a foreigner who lived among the Israelites, he had the right to be redeemed or bought back by another Israelite, by a close relative, or if that man somehow acquired some wealth, he had the right to buy his own freedom. The price to buy his freedom was based on the number of years until the next Jubilee. If the Israelite was not redeemed, even though he had been sold to a foreigner, the Jubilee laws still required the foreigner to release that man in the year of Jubilee. So if you were a foreigner, you moved into Canaan with the Israelites, you had to abide by their laws regarding the purchase and selling and redeeming and freedom of hired servants. Okay, so that is Leviticus chapter 25. Sorry this chapter was so long, but there's just a lot to talk about. So that might be a record for length. Although I did put out one the other day that was like 8 minutes and I cringed as I was editing it. But let's talk about our application, then we'll close. Allowing yourself to rest can be a statement of faith. It can be tempting to work 24/7. I'm sometimes tempted to do that, especially on the things that we value, because it's easy to wrongly believe that our success depends on our work ethic alone. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking, well, if I'm not working, then nothing is being done and no progress is being made. I think this is why God instituted these Sabbaths every 7 days, Sabbaths every 7 years, and then the 50th year Sabbath of rest. Resting from work, even godly work, needs to be done as a reminder to ourselves that God is working even when we are not, and that the success of our endeavors depends much more on God's blessing of our work than us just putting in a 7-day work week, 80-hour work week. When we get consumed in our work, it's easy to forget that God is the key ingredient to success, and He's the one who determines whether we're successful or not. If you're a workaholic, maybe you ought to implement something similar to what the Israelites were told to do. A dedicated day of stepping back from your work and trusting that God will manage things and reminding yourself that He's really the one in charge.